a fellow and the chair of the Egypt Exploration Society. Well, that's what I didn't know about. Dr. Price has dedicated his career to the study and preservation of ancient Egyptian and Sudanese artifacts, and has been instrumental in bringing these fascinating cultures to a wider audience. He has curated numerous exhibitions and authored several books and articles on topics related to Egyptology, including religion, funerary practices, and magic in ancient Egypt. Dr. Campbell Price has been actively involved in discussions around the restitution of African artifacts. As the curator of a major collection of Egyptian and Sudanese artifacts, he has been engaged in ongoing conversations about the reparation of cultural heritage objects to their countries of origin. So, without much further ado, I will hand you over to.
Thank you, Professor Bell. How did you follow Sir Lancelot? My God. Happy Africa Day to everybody. I'll keep my comments quite brief, but hopefully they follow on from my colleague, Dr. Chipangura, who spoke this morning. I'm an Egyptologist. Ever since I was a little kid, I grew up in Glasgow, in Scotland, and I was just obsessed with ancient Egyptian stuff. And it was going into a museum and seeing things in front of me that made the connection for me. And I was thinking about this yesterday, particularly. I put the story on social media because sadly we lost the late, great Tina Turner, a great singer. I remember really being very young and reading a newspaper story that Tina Turner had given an interview, and she said she visited Egypt and she believed she was one of the female pharaohs, Queen Hatshepsut, reincarnated. And I'm absolutely obsessed with this story. So in primary school, the teacher asked the class, which celebrity do you want to meet? And all the boys said football players. And I said, Tina Turner. So I had this connection with Tina Turner in ancient Egypt. Apparently, she really was interested in Egyptian history, in antiquity. She collected a lot of material. But I've mentioned that story because so much of ancient Egypt is in people's minds. It's an imagined space. A lot of visitors to Manchester Museum, I think Egypt is in the mid-Atlantic on some kind of an island. It's not, it's in Africa. That's just a geographical fact. If I can make this move on. Manchester Museum has 18,000 objects from Egypt and Sudan, antiquities, in addition to material in what we currently call the Living Cultures collection. And so as a museum, we're welcoming hundreds of thousands of people, and they have questions like, how did you get 18,000 objects from Egypt and Sudan? They didn't just drop out of the sky. And it's a theme I know Njaba may have talked about earlier, that a lot of the job of being a curator now is not to say, I am the expert and I'm going to tell you about the history or the meaning of an object. It is a kind of restitution of knowledge where you accept that you may not be the most knowledgeable person about a certain subject. So Egypt and Sudan are simply in the northeast of Africa. That's a fact. We welcomed at the museum last week two Egyptian colleagues, one an Egyptologist, the other a cartoon artist called Nasser Jr., who's very popular in Egypt. And they were talking about, for them as Egyptians, they felt that they were always the middle ground. Whenever there is a debate about the peace process in the Middle East today, Egypt is usually the mediator in those kind of debates. Egypt is often not considered as an indigenous community, because at least at state level, the government is very interested in attracting tourism. And to attract international interest means giving up what in other parts of the world would be considered indigenous interests. This isn't just a museum issue. If you take the recent case of a Netflix treatment of Queen Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, basically, the last ruler of Egypt before Egypt was invaded by the Romans, the fact that she had been depicted by a Black British actress caused shock to some people. She is no less accurate a depiction of Cleopatra than Elizabeth Taylor. I think Elizabeth Taylor is more likely inaccurate, but it is a really powerful example of identity politics in Egypt itself and around the world about how we view ancient Egypt. So my job, when I talk about restituting knowledge, is to bring the debates of contemporary society, popular culture, people who watch Netflix, to understand the museum collection better. Many more people watch Netflix than sadly come to Manchester Museum, although we've had almost 500,000 people in through the door in 3 months. Ancient Egypt is exceptional. It's always seen as unusual, the heights of artistry. It has a very distinctive way of depicting things in art, especially people. There is a very hieroglyphic style to art. So when you have material like this, 2 coffins of 2 men called Knum Nacht and Nacht Ike, they're known as the 2 brothers. When these are on display, they're very popular. People queue up to come and see these. They're very easy to reproduce. They photograph very nicely. People instantly look at that and know this is ancient Egyptian. So the reason they are seen in that way is because Egypt is seen, as I say, as exceptional, unusual, not connected to any other part of the world. And it's a question that's often asked: how did material like this end up in the northwest of England? Short answer: colonialism. There was a system, and I'm asked this a lot by students, called fines division. So in the 1880s, a rule was set up, and to show this is important. In 1882, the British invaded Egypt because Egypt had a very important thing called the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is still in Egyptian and modern political Egyptian territory, and it controlled access from the Mediterranean to the British imperial possessions in South Asia. So if you wanted to get to India, it was much more efficient to go through the Suez Canal than it was to go all the way around Africa. So because of this, I mean, people sometimes say archaeology is neutral or it's a science. Archaeology is never neutral. Museums are never neutral. They present a politicized vision of the world. So in the 1880s, as a result of all this, just building the Suez Canal basically broke the bank in Egypt at a state level. And so then the Egyptian state, the Egyptian government, owed lots of money to European powers who financed the making of the Suez Canal, which benefited them. So Egypt was constantly in debt to Europe, particularly to France and to Britain. And so as a result, when the Egyptians didn't pay the debts, the British decided we'd invade to take back control of the Suez Canal, which continued until the 1950s. So as a result of that, I should say, there was this system of fines division in which the best things, 50%, if you're an archaeologist and you go and dig stuff up, the best stuff was said to be for the national collection. So it stayed in Cairo, but then up to 50% of the rest of the finds that were made were exported to other places, like Britain or America or other places in the world. So there was a colonial system that already controlled archaeology. It was legal at the time but it wasn't necessarily moral by today's standards. So when it came to doing Egyptology at Manchester Museum, this is a photograph from 1908, where there were unwrappings of mummified bodies, mummified remains. This was done very much in the pursuit of science, but it was done with a very colonial, highly racist set of assumptions about how we should understand ancient people. So the archaeologist shown there, the lady in the pinafore, Margaret Murray, was very interested in defining race. So she believed, in the people she worked with, that you could take measurements of the body and you could define someone's race based on these measurements. This came from a sense of colonial anxiety about who the ancient Egyptians were. Because if they weren't what the British elite expected, then this could be a problem. So Egyptology is, in its origin and continues to be in its practice, a colonial science that was based originally on this quest for racialized difference. This guy, bearded guy, he is often praised as the father of Egyptian archaeology. He set the science up in many ways. He was very prolific. He published very promptly, but he was really interested in eugenics. He wanted to measure parts of people, not just dead people, not just dead ancient Egyptians, but living British school children, because he believed if people had certain characteristics, he could breed them out. So this kind of eugenics discussion, sometimes people say, oh, he was just a man of his time. He was very interested in racial hierarchy. And we all know what happened. Nazi Germany happened. So these are very sinister histories that the museum, I'm proud that Manchester Museum has started to address these, but they absolutely undercut all discussion of Egyptian archaeology. Colleagues in America at the Brooklyn Museum have done work on addressing particular issues within the visitor base, especially from African American visitors who ask questions like, why are the noses broken on statues? And one of the answers was, and the honest answers from the Egyptologists at the museum was not that this was a way of Edwardian or Victorian Egyptologists denying who the Egyptians were. It was assumed that all elite ancient Egyptians were white Caucasian people. So why would these elite Egyptologists want to damage the noses of them? So there starts a question from visitors, why are things the way they are? And in fact, the reality is even more racist and even more damning than people might assume. Within Egypt itself and within the way we talk about Egyptology, a lot of our words that we use are based on colonial terms. So this is an example from around the reign of King Tutankhamun. So everyone knows King Tut. This is a group of princes to the south of Egypt bringing gold to the Egyptian pharaoh. The historical reality is probably that the Egyptians were trading with different parts of Africa, and they were giving some things to these princes. These princes were bringing gold from gold mines in different parts of East Africa. But when these scenes were discovered in the 1800s, it was assumed this was evidence for the Egyptian empire. And so the words that are used, like tribute and viceroy, I mean, viceroy, we talk about the viceroy of India, who was the British colonial official in India. These are transposed onto the ancient past to create a vision that resembled elite British culture around about 1880. So what are we doing with this at Manchester Museum? Why am I talking about it? So in the past, in the last 10 or 15 years, the museum has a very important function to bring together diverse groups of scholars, people with various interests, to have open and honest conversations. And I'm glad that continues. But one of the key milestones, at least in Egyptology, in the study of ancient Egypt, was a conference in 2011, organized by my predecessor, Karen Excel, and you can see the presentations for this on YouTube. And it was simply an attempt to talk about Egypt in its African context. And still, for a lot of people, this is very innovative and strange, but because Egypt had been seen as a kind of honorary European country, this corrective very much was necessary. Although it's interesting that the learning done at that conference has not generally been taken on in other parts of the discipline. It did, however, influence how we display the collection in Manchester Museum. So the show, it's not really a show, it's a gallery, what was called the Ancient Worlds Gallery, resulted from a lot of conversations. Of course, there could have been more conversations. Curators have to make decisions. Curators still hold a lot of power, but actually, that's where me and Arin Mabel first met, because you came and you advised on the galleries. Although I think you've both grown up a bit.
My son came here.
Yes. So excited you've grown. Yeah. But the point is important here, that there was the beginnings of a series of conversations where you talk about curatorial knowledge. How do you know stuff about it? Of course, you know, you can learn languages and you can study art. You know, I can tell you what hieroglyphs mean, but the meaning of things, the meaning of objects in lived context, I remember a couple of meetings we had with a group of Nigerian ladies, and you came and you looked at jewelry. And we were just talking about how jewelry might be used, how colors might be used, and we talked about makeup, which I've not generally worn. So my kind of restricted, you know, really white Scottish guy attitude was expanded simply by having the conversation. This is learning which doesn't just happen once. When you talk about bridge building and connections, you can't sever the connection, you have to keep the conversation going. So the displays, the old displays, they're currently being changed. And Angelo and I are working on this currently as we speak. This is a space, this is just one physical space, and it's only a showcase, it's only a window into some of our conversations. But I think with groups I've worked with, to come in and see something that you co-curated on display feels like, yeah, it feels like the right thing to do, and it feels like a way of valuing the conversation. So it's not just something that happens face to face, it's something that's reflected in a so-called permanent display. We experimented with programming, thinking outside the box. I'm particularly interested in Afrofuturism. I know colleagues in Leiden at the National Museum of Antiquities have a major exhibition planned this coming year on Afrofuturism and Egyptology. But I remember we had a couple of film screenings and we screened like traditional mummy movies, which were popular. We screened Space is the Place, and it was sold out both times we did it. So we knew that there was something not quite right with our programming strategy. I should also mention our international work. In the past, through the British Museum, we have engaged quite extensively with colleagues in Egypt and Sudan, other parts of Africa. But the problem here is that the British Museum tends to organize things from the point of view of the British know best. So the British are inviting people to have conversations on the British Museum's terms. And in my experiences in Egypt and Sudan, often our Egyptian and Sudanese colleagues know best and can teach British curators. So there's an unevenness in power balance there, which probably could be corrected. And I remember visiting a colleague of Ijabu and I's, Nelson, who works in the National Museum of Uganda in Kampala. And we had a workshop on interpretation. And I remember we talked about material for which there were replicas in Kampala. and the original stuff was all in one room. And when you're actually debating it there in Kampala, it seems quite clear that restitution isn't just a conversation, it is sending stuff physically back to the place it came from. And I'm proud to say Manchester Museum has entered into those discussions, as perhaps you heard earlier, in ways that other museums don't. We're a university museum, we're not a national museum, so we're not governed by the laws that are often used as an excuse for not sending material back to where it was found, taken, stolen from. I close with this image because, as many of you know, if you read the news, there is pretty severe civil unrest in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, but I was very privileged to get to go, and it really was a privilege, 5 or 6 years ago, to spend some time in Khartoum. And one evening after Friday prayers, we went to Omdurman, which is an area just outside the city of Khartoum. And there was Sufik dancing going on around the mosque. And I wouldn't say I'm a very spiritual person, but I had a feeling of connection like I've never experienced in my life, that what was going on there, this kind of ritualized get together, there was dancing, there was singing. To me, it felt like something very ancient, and that wasn't something that was displayed through objects. It was something that you feel. And so with that in mind, I hope we can continue conversations in the future. Do please follow me on that. Thank you.
I think as all of you would have heard, there's been this theme that's been running through, today. Not only is it Africa Day, but the theme running through of spirituality being a real thing other than a 3D thing. We've heard about stories, the stories that are behind objects that we see, that we know of. What are those stories attached to them? Those living stories, not story. Even if they're stories from the past, they're still living stories of communities that still exist today. But before you leave,
I have to see the questions.
Yes, you do have to take some questions. Any questions? I heard a lot of.
Agree.
Yes, in the background. Yes.
Yeah, stolen legacy.
Uh-huh.
I think in these museums they have all African treasures which have been stolen. And for me personally, looking at history through black eyes and seeing that the Nile is the source of civilization, and to see all our artifacts inside museums, like the lady says, our youth don't know who they are. And if our legacy has been stolen, then we would like them returned. And if we can start that understanding on how we can have access to our knowledge of our history, then I think that's a start.
Great comment. I cannot agree with it more. Yes, thank you. Yes, sir.
Part of a community that's trying to educate people of areas, how would you encourage us as community leaders and organizers to gather our church groups or Sunday groups or park groups to come and visit these artifacts, or to encourage our local schools and get the local government policies? After George Floyd, there's a lot of black this and that. How can we galvanize that energy where our youth can access this information in a safe space, where it's not just being pulled by individual parents, but as a collective of part of their curriculum? It's in Manchester, we don't access it.
It's on the doorstep.
Yeah, so what can we do in terms of addressing our groups, our local councillors, to say, this is happening here, how could you not, I don't know, fund us or contribute us to go towards this collective? What would your suggestions be as an institution?
Great question. And it's one, I guess, we're wrestling with, is how to say, obviously we're open to the conversation, but having a conversation like this is not bringing 20 people into the museum. Like you said, funding is quite important. So even if you don't have the transport links, if you want to bring someone from Bolton, say. I mean, the museum could probably better partner with community groups to raise money to allow people to come if it's a distance. The museum is thankfully free, so we don't charge for exhibitions. But that's unusual. I think it's unusual, especially for special exhibitions, that they're just free. But the thing, especially about young people, is, in my experience, where we brought in school groups. So if you got 20 school kids, they'd all go home to their families and bring the families. So that was the biggest thing you could do, was to target younger people early. But I guess the museum just has to constantly check itself as a university, because when I was young, my parents didn't go to university. They wouldn't have thought to go onto a university campus. So I think a lot of people just don't think this part of town is for them. I'm not sure how to change that effectively. I would say the museum just has to unthink some of its own intellectual barriers.
Yeah, I agree.
It's just some outreach as well.
Outreach, some more outreach would be useful, yeah.
Thank you.
But next class, and then I'll come to yourself.
All right, so this conversation with Cleopatra.
Yeah.
On Netflix, I was part of it, I mean,
Mm.
to a point where I was fighting with a lot of people, coming in to say she's not African.
Mhm.
Now we want people of African, of African origin, not North African origin, let's say other African origins, to come and see. I love Egypt, I love Egyptology, I've been fascinated about it. So that won't put me off, but there are a lot of people who don't, Egyptians, in a sense, when you see the conversation and the arguments, seems to think they are not part of Africa. So why would I, as a West African woman, want to come and see something at the Manchester Museum, when the Egyptians don't think, we're part of them and they don't think they're part of us. I don't know if you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So that is a conversation that needs to be brought together by the university and everybody else, how we can merge all the parts of Africa and North Africa for them to understand that, look, for this thing to work.
Yeah.
You all have to have an understanding that you have one thing in common. Because that was what I said to a lot of people. I don't care what you say, I don't care your conversation. Look, the continent, I don't know where Egypt is from, but my reckoning is in actually Africa.
Yeah.
There's no way you're going to change that. So we're trying to bring, going into a West African community, a South African community, say, common, there's this thing happening in Manchester. It's here. I live in Shaw, that's in Oldham. I've been here for an event. I've been through the Egyptian when it was under renovation or something. It scared me a bit. I'm like, why haven't I been?
Yeah.
What? You look at this and I'm like, well, I want to waste my time all that way.
It's an absolutely.
So I don't know if that's a conversation that needs to be had.
Yes, thank you very much, because I've talked to a couple of colleagues about this, where the coverage of the Japan stuff was so shockingly racist. I can't speak for Egyptian colleagues because I'm not Egyptian, but it's a conversation that needs to be had more explicitly, because I think people think, the museum is like one thing, and that debate about Netflix is a different thing. They're basically the same. Yeah.
Yes.
I was brought up to believe that the pyramids and the pharaohs and that came from Sudan, and at the moment loads of sand have covered all these pyramids and pharaohs. It hasn't even been dug up, and I think they moved up further up to the north, where we call Egypt. And I would say, yes, there were all people of color, and most of them in Sudan would have been dark brown, so they were black, basically. And you're an anthropologist, yeah?
I'm not an anthropologist.
Yeah, okay.
An Egyptologist. I'm more interested in art than I am.
Yeah, why have you ever come to Sudan? Go. and move the sand and see the pyramids and find pharaohs and monuments of.
Well, I think
Yeah.
first of all, yeah. Jump on, why don't you? We're through. There are more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. That is absolutely true. It's a pub quiz question. Which country in the world has the most pyramids? No, Egypt. Sudan. Archaeology has this funny habit of throwing up things that you don't realize are there. I'm not claiming that everything has been found. So you may well be right. There are unknown monuments, unknown discoveries, unknown people.
So you believe that in Egypt, they're the ancestors of the original pharaoh?
I mean, interaction was complex. People moved around all the time.
Yeah.
That's all we know. People moved around.
But there is carving, not wooden carving, stone carvings.
It's there are lots of
Of
stone
black
carvings. It
people.
depends how you interpret them.
Well, I mean,
And that's
we're talking in the old world, Negroes were there
undoubtedly.
in Sudan, and there were sort of like pyramids and
Yeah.
figures. So you should really concentrate on the Sudan and then mention about Egypt being probably later on as we move up north.
If we have the chance, there will be a big show on ancient African archaeology. Watch this space, is all I'm saying.
So, before you go, the name Egypt, can you tell me where it comes from?
It is an ancient Egyptian term meaning the temple of the god Ptah.
Ptah.
So it comes through Greek. So ancient Egyptian would sound like something like Ptah, and that becomes Aegyptos, becomes Egypt.
So it's from Greece named it.
Greece named it Egypt.
But what was the name before Greece's came?
It's called different things. It's called, I think I know where you're going with this. It's called Ta Mary, the beloved land,
Okay.
or it's called Kemet, which means the black land.
Okay. Yeah, so just trying to.
Yeah, got you. Got you.
What's the name?
It's called Maser in Arabic. Yeah. Not sure where that comes from. I think about it.
Okay, another one over here.
Yeah, mine is, it's a comment, but also a question. Talking about the film Cleopatra, you commented on colonialism and that it seems the intention was that people should separate, particularly the indigenous people of Egypt from Egypt. So now I'm taking it from the comment of Chantel about not wanting to get involved with anything to do with Egypt. Would we say that mentality may be one day and it's still prevalent today, that people now don't, particularly Africans, associate themselves with Egypt?
It's true that, and I've heard that from several other friends, that it comes back to Egyptian exceptionalism, which may be not just commentators, outside commentators like me, are saying Egypt is exceptional, but Egyptians themselves may claim they're exceptional. But as you know, if anyone's visited Egypt, it's a very diverse population. So it's who's claiming who's exceptional. I don't know.
Lots of brown skinned people in Egypt.
Absolutely.
Different shades.
Absolutely.
Okay, another one at the front.
Aye.
Pyramids in Giza.
Yeah,
Perfectly aligned with your star constellation,
it has been claimed.
you know, and it's been claimed.
Yeah.
Wow. Because they put a map over the Orion star constellation, and put a map over the pyramids of Giza, and they're perfectly lined up. So I don't know if you say it's going to be a claim or that's natural star. I don't know.
Yeah. It depends whether you believe they intentionally lined them up, I guess.
I do believe they essentially, you just put on space, you know.
Yeah. No,
That space link, you know, that space.
Yeah.
You know, to go on the landmass, that
Yeah.
all of the
pyramids around the place. If you go and put up a star constellation or a star map on them, they'll say that these pyramids are perfectly aligned with the stars around the world, not around the world in
that part of
in
the
the
world.
universe. I mean, if that's the fact, they're going to say, well, they must come from somewhere. And if they say they're coming from somewhere because they've got the pyramids lined up with Giza, they're not pyramids lined, they're lined up lined up with Giza. And if it's lined up with let me just get this right and exact stuff.
You know better than me.
If no, so I wear a symbol just to go and try and acknowledge the journey. If this place is the, somebody mentioned that the Nile River was the cradle of civilization, and if that's part of Egypt, it's also mentioned in the Bible, talking about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the river of the White Nile. Well, what I really focus on is especially now. I'm just saying, if that was the case, and it was able to go and find out that these entities, what came to the planet, but these entities, what came to the planet. Now I want to stop the question.
All I'll say is I don't have a time machine, so I can't check how they built them. So your belief is as valid as mine.
Yeah,
That's all I can say. There's space for both.
Yeah, just a quick one. Sorry for joining the class.
No.
My last visit to Egypt, I saw the pyramids, and you can see the Sphinx, for example. They've been, some of the stones are kind of like creeping off, falling off. So are we losing the originality of the ancient Egypt, or all the builders and all the men, or what do you see to that? Are they not just going to fall off?
The problem, I guess, with any kind of archaeology or history is things are decaying all the time. So either someone tries to restore something, and then of course there's a debate about how did you restore it, why did you do it in a certain way,
Or in a certain color.
or in a certain color, in a certain form. But the authenticity question, this is why I don't like the word preservation, because we can't say we're going to preserve everything because we can't preserve everything. So things are just going to naturally decay over time. New things will appear, well, not new things, old things will reappear, but we can't. Time moves on and things are going to change. And I don't think we'll ever be able to stop that. I don't know if that answers your point. It's just this unstoppable march of history. And I think archaeologists sometimes think, oh, we can preserve everything and put it in a museum. Things in the museum are falling apart very slowly as well. So that's just the human conditioning. Yes.
I think I've got one more. I'm from Glasgow, born in Glasgow, 1948.
Great.
Right.
It's great.
So I'm
Lovely part of town.
brother of yours.
Yes.
But the thing is, I used to go around churches here, right? And you're finding quite a lot of churches out and about. You see these stone figures with noses chopped off, and that was done deliberately in the sort of referendum and things like that to these monuments of people that when they had a bit of a revolution or problem. So I would have thought noses like that in Egypt, when they chopped off that, they've been deliberately.
There's a lot of deliberate damage.
Similar to the church, when you rise in it, why the noses up? No, there's some trouble, 1400s, 1300s.
The easiest thing.
Yeah, they chop the noses off. That's what people do. I'm just thinking that probably, and the French, apparently, I think, I've only ever seen one picture of a cannon, right, of where the Sphinx is, where the nose is. They were shooting a cannon towards Sphinx. So there's a possibility that they may have the French. English, the French.
I mean, you may have heard the story or not, because there was a story about Manchester Museum about an artifact that was moving and turning round. The museum.
A little statue.
A little statue. And it was moving Talk about, because I find it fascinating.
Oh, I should have put in a slide for you.
Oh,
I
yeah.
could put the video in.
Oh,
So I was saying to Irma, we did a little interview. It's on YouTube. So this is the most famous thing of the 4.5 million things in the whole collection. This little statuette started moving in the case. It was in a different position every day.
what would we look it up?
It would be on YouTube if you put Manchester Museum spinning statue. And I went into the gallery every day and it was locked, the case was locked and alarmed, and I had the only key. And it moved every day. So we set up a video, like a time-lapse camera that took one photo every hour for a week. Is that it? That's the one. That's it. That's it. Okay.
Where can I say the outside? Yeah, so big.
I think because that's the official Manchester Uni one. So we set up this camera on it, and so you can see it's a locked case, locked, alarmed, and it moved almost 360 degrees round. And you notice it moves more in the light, in the daylight.
Well, nobody noticed it was moving.
Must be heavy traffic outside when the bus is.
That was actually it was like but it's the only thing from Manchester Museum that's ever been featured in Simpsons. Because they used that in an episode of The Simpsons.
Which barrel was that?
And it probably, by the style of the guy, he's probably about 1800 BC. So like 3,800 years old. But it's not a pharaoh, it's just a wealthy guy.
Was it marble on marble?
It was stone, but the base was not completely flat. So normally we would put it on like some kind of conservation support, but it was just in the glass shell. And it moved right. And we had people coming in with lottery tickets. Because they believed it was going to give them luck. It was the mummies. Yeah. I said to someone, they said, it's a conspiracy. You're doing this for publicity. Campbell Price is responsible.
Yeah.
So it was on the internet. And I said in response, the only person who's in there at night has been dead for 3,000 years. So that didn't help crush the rumor. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to our 4 brilliant presenters and speakers today. We've had Jabu, Chikangura, Olamide, Dobunola, Lancelot Odua, Amantu, and Dr. Campbell Price. One big round of applause for that. And I'd like to recognize in our midst some people that don't normally come to things like this. And what they've been invited here, and they've turned up there, which is really good. First of all, the Little Film Society. Don't know what they are, what they do. They've got their little booklets. So it's a very interesting society, actually, when you start reading about them. And also, I'd like to recognize, you know me, I am a Nollywood fan. And you probably recognize, oh yeah. My children come.
I'm happy to be here.
Oh, when my children took my house, my grandchildren. Oh,
I'm happy to be here.
I'd like to recognize in the house, ladies first, Georgina Mr. George Akin. No, that's and AC.
Assistant Commissioner of Police.
I was going to say before I advertise your name. Oh, Assistant Commissioner of Police, C. Ihunwa.
Ihunwa.
Very much. much for your presence. Thank you so much for being in attendance. Thank you. Thank you so much for being in town. We took over one more person, who is the, what's your title? What's your title? Ambassador. It's an ambassador from Guinea, but by the UN. Yeah. I know you always come down on it. You have got a huge title. All of you are ambassadors of the information that you've heard today, the knowledge that you've gathered today. So go out and share that knowledge, have conversations with other people, that they can also get hold of some of this knowledge. And hopefully this time next year, we'll come back again, but we'll be bigger and better.